Good morning, everyone. This is the second day of the conference. Now we start session 4 on rebalancing external and internal demand-driven growth spurts to invigorate growth potential. The session chair is Deputy Governor of the Bank of Korea, Jun-Il Kim. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning. I hope you had a good sleep last night, particularly those who traveled a long way to attend this conference. Excuse me. As the title says, this session is about demand rebalancing and economic growth. As we recall, the rebalancing issue has been at the center of the policy discussion on the post-crisis economic recovery. In this context, the need for demand rebalancing in the Asian economies, and China in particular, has received particular attention. But rebalancing might be much easier said than done. In fact, Korea's experience may be a case in point. After the 1997 financial crisis, a growing consensus has emerged in our society with regard to the need to shift the gear from export-led growth to more domestic demand-driven growth, primarily for macroeconomic stability reasons. At the same time, however, there has always been fear of falling growth that the departure from the proven success model might entail. Indeed, Korea's dependence on external demand is now even higher than 15 years ago. So, having said that, we are fortunate to have distinguished speakers and discussants who will address the growth implications of demand rebalancing in China and other Asian economies. The first speaker is Professor Jung-Hwa Lee of Korea University, to my left. And to further left, the second speaker is Dr. Nicholas Lardy of the Peterson Institute. We have two discussants, Professor Takeo Hoshi from Stanford University and Professor Kwon-Oh Shin from Korea University. I think it's 20 minutes, each presentation is for 20 minutes and discussion is for 10 minutes. So let's start with Professor Jung-Hwa Lee, please.
Okay, good morning, everybody. First, let me thank Bank of Korea and Tom Sargent and Barry Eichengreen for this kind invitation to this important conference. The topic I'll discuss today is the Asia's rebalancing and growth. And this is based on my joint work with two co-authors, Professor So-Young Kim at the Seoul National University. He may show up later or now. And then Warwick McKibben from the Australian National Universities. So I'll present the paper and all the errors and mistakes are theirs here. So that's the division of labor. And I'll just discuss three issues. One is why this is the important topic and what I would like to do in this paper. And we'll use the two different methodologies. One is the VAR. The other one is the more large-scale structural model and the global models. And we'll present the empirical result, and we'll show they are quite consistent in terms of the major result. And then we'll suggest some policies for Asia's rebalancing. The purpose of the study is this is about the rebalancing, as just the moderator says, the rebalancing between the internal demand and external demand-driven growth in Asia. This has been the issue. Of course, this rebalancing issues, not just between internal and external demand, even internally, internal imbalances between saving and investment, as well as the external imbalances between export and import. They are important issues, but they all linked. I'll not get into the details, but currently the issue is whether we can continue to rely on the export-led economic growth, or we need to diversify source of the growth. That's the question. Well, people suggest we need to rebalance, but the question here, even though rebalancing is good for the balanced growth, whether it can help to sustain strong growth in Asia, I think has been the little discussion of the impact of rebalancing on the long-term economic growth in Asia. So we're trying to evaluate the impact of the demand side rebalancing. Here, mainly focus on the consumption side, but we can discuss briefly on the investment side. And then we try to compare the empirical result to the purely supply-driven productivity change, and then we can see whether this kind of rebalancing could help to supplement supply-side productive change or to replace the supply-side productive change. And there are two different methodologies we adopt. One is the structural VAR model. There are 3 variable models, and people may like this type of the model, but if you don't like, we have a huge scale global model. This is the intertemporal, much more like close to the dynamic stochastic general equilibrium model. So you can see the empirical result and compare them. And then we'll suggest the rebalancing policies. Let me summarize the major result of our papers. We look at the impact of the demand rebalancing while keeping the productivity change not happen. So it's basically this is we call productivity neutral demand rebalancing shocks identified by VAR, also identified in the structural, more general equilibrium model that do not have permanent effect on the domestic output in Asia. So even though rebalancing could help over the short term to stimulate economic growth through the demand side, it cannot have a permanent impact on the economic growth. Well, this may not be so surprised. But when we did some individual country exercise, actually there are some positive impact. In China's case, China's rebalancing, especially by increasing consumption, we may have some permanent impact on the output growth in China, as well as the positive spillovers to the outputs of Korea and Taiwan, which are more highly linked to the Chinese economy through trade. And we also evaluated the shocks coming from the labor productivity increase in China and the Asian economies that has very significantly positive permanent effect on output, not just in Asia, but also globally. So we had some discussion yesterday. Actually, the Asia's productivity growth could have a positive spillovers to the non-Asian countries that confirms. But over the short term, actually the labor productivity shocks in Asia could be negatively transmitted to the foreign GDP here, mainly United States. So I think our suggestion is not just the rebalancing, but it's the promoting productivity growth is good for Asia as well as for the global economy. So let me just give some background here very briefly by showing the only 3 charts. One chart is the basically raising the question on the important issues, whether Asia rely too much on external demand. Well, this is very hard to assess, actually. People saying that the Asian countries rely quite high on the external demand. We all understand Asia's strong growth originated from the export-oriented strategy. So there is no reason why we should get out of this outward-oriented strategy. But there are several issues related to this high vulnerability to the external shocks, and then also the possibility of global stagnation. This downside risk always raised some risks to the Asian countries. So, it might be better to have another source of the economic growth, and the domestic demand could play the second engine of the growth in addition to the external demand. This chart shows the share of the export value added in GDP generated by the IMF. This is not a gross export to GDP ratio because the export will use foreign produced outputs. So maybe the impact on the domestic economy could be assessed only based on the value added. But even using the value added terms, their export shares in GDP in Asian countries are quite high, especially Malaysia and Singapore, Thailand, Taiwan, and compared to the OECD countries. But of course, we are not really saying what is the optimal size or not, but it increased vulnerabilities. Well, the counterpart to the high external demand is the low domestic demand. The question is, are domestic demand too low in Asia? This is also very difficult to assess, but consumption and investment GDP ratios vary substantially across Asia. But by comparing to other countries, some countries have very weak consumption demand or investment demand. The China case is we all understand that the private consumption ratio is quite low compared to the even other Asian countries. And Philippines stand out as very low investment countries. So basically, of course, we are not denying that the external demand could be played important role for Asia's growth for a long period, but having another source of growth would be good for Asia. Then the question is, even though it says diversified source of growth is good, whether it can help to sustain long-term growth in Asian countries. We need to assess that. Actually, there is a very limited study on evaluating the long-term impact of the rebalancing in Asian countries. So we start from the one empirical model. This is the structural VAR model, and the three variables, and the three variables are all non-stationary, and they are not co-integrated with each other. So we put the three variables. I is the country I. So for one country, we have three variables structural model, and we put some long-term recursive zero restrictions. Here, the shock to the first equation can have an impact on all the three variables, but the shock to the second variable could have only impact to the second and third variables, and then shock to the third variable would not have any impact on the first and second variable. So this kind of the structure is very similar to what Garley did in 1999 papers. And we also combined the 10 Asian economies together and set up the panel structures. So what are the variables here, X1, X2, X3? We use two different orderings, and one is number one is the labor productivity, second variable is the domestic demand, and third variable is the output. So basically, the first shock to the labor productivity could have an impact on the three variables, but second shock, which is identified as the productivity neutral demand balancing shock, could have an impact on the only second variable, that's the domestic output, as well as the output. So we're trying to use these different orderings, but the model one is, I just explained, labor productivity, domestic demand, and output. And model two used the different orderings, starting from the domestic output and labor productivity and outputs. And so from here, we're trying to estimate using the 10 Asian economies, the annual data, starting from the 1960, and we put the two legs. Okay, and this is the impulse response function based on the panel estimations. And as we can see, the first productivity shock here actually have a significant positive impact permanently on the output. That might not be surprising. Everyone understands that. But it does not have any long-term impact on the domestic output. So that's identified. And then here, productivity neutral rebalancing, that's the second variable. Here, actually, it's a very weak and insignificant result. So our interpretation here is that the effect of productivity shock on output is strong and significant, but in contrast, the effect of productivity neutral rebalancing shock on output is weak and insignificant. So if you want to have a very significant impact from the rebalancing shocks to Asian countries, you may be disappointed. But we'll get to some individual country cases. Okay, this is a model two with starting from the different orderings. So rebalancing shock is first, and then the rebalancing neutral production shock here. Again, the rebalancing shock has a very insignificant impact on the output, but while the rebalancing neutral productive shock has the positive significant impact on the output. So if we want to have some permanent positive effect on the economic growth, rebalancing alone cannot help to make Asian countries grow fast. Basically, we need some rise in the productivity growth. That might be too obvious. Okay. we get the individual country estimation. Again, there was the 3-variable structure for each country, and we combined the 10 economies together. So that's the average impact. Now, this individual country impact is based on each country's estimations. And then this is quite consistent with the panel result. Permanent labor productivity shock is more fundamental, more important for long-term economic growth. So we need to improve the productivity for sustained growth. But the long-term effect of productivity neutral rebalancing shock are quite different across the countries. Some countries are quite positive to output growth. That's the China, Indonesia, Philippines, and Thailand. But it's not significant in Japan, Korea, Malaysia, and Singapore. And the effects is sometimes negative in India. So this is the individual country estimation. I selected only 2 countries. And in China's case, as I explained, this is the only China case. So productivity shock has, of course, positive and significant impact on the China's growth. But productivity neutral rebalancing growth will also have some positive, significant impact on economic growth. Korea's case, but no significant impact. So maybe there is some impact from the rebalancing to China. We also did trying to measure the spillovers because we require, then the model becomes larger and larger. So we did up to here, but only gave the shock to the China and then trying to put China as another variable. And then whether this has any impact on the output of the other Asian countries. Actually, interesting thing is some positive impact on the Taiwan and Korea, but not many other countries. So our interpretation here is where China's rebalancing would have some positive spillovers to Korea and Taiwan, maybe through the trade linkages. Okay, so this in general, basically this idea, what we had in advance before designing this paper was maybe productivity would be more important than just the demand switching, but we were a little bit surprised that the individual country has a different result. So we're trying to use the much more large-scale models. This is a big model. This is started in 1980s by the McKibben, Sachs, and Jorgensen, Wilcoxon. And then this model is the current version is constructed by McKibben and Wilcoxon. It's combining the macro model. It's similar to the dynamic stochastic general equilibrium model, and also this has industries computable general equilibrium models. So inter-industry input-output linkages and capital movement and consumption investment dynamics are in the models, and this is annual frequency, and all the calibrations are pretty much based on the estimation of the trade elasticities and consumption, production, substitution elasticities. Okay, I'll not get into the details of the model, but it is pretty much a new Keynesian style model. It allows some wage stickiness and unemployment and some rational expectations, but also there are some adaptive expectations, and liquidity constraints are there. And the financial flows are very important in this, as well as the trade linkages are very important in these global models. And there are 17 countries and regional blocks. For Asia, there are 6 blocks: Australia, Korea, where McKibben is from Australia, so Australia is very important here. Of course, but I deleted Australia and present my result here. Sorry for Warwick McKibben, but so Australia, Korea, and China, India, Indonesia, other Asia represent the Asia here. And there are 6 sectors: and energy, agriculture, non-durable manufacturing, and mining, durable manufacturing, and services. So there are 2 experiments. One is the permanent rise in consumption ratio by 3% of GDP per year in China alone, and then in all Asian countries together. And we also experiment a rise in the labor productivity growth by 1 percentage point per year over the 50 years in China and separately in all Asian countries together. Here I present only a result from the consumption shocks, but we did the shock with investment ratios, but qualitatively the results are quite similar, so we'll skip it. And this is we summarize the impact of the consumption shocks on GDP in Asia and other non-Asian countries. Here I just put the only United States. There are two lines. One is the red color. That's the shock only to China, and the green line represents the impact of the shocks to the GDP by the increase in the consumption overall across the all Asian countries here. So, as you can see, for long term, actually the shock going back to zero. So there is no permanent impact on the economic growth or GDP, but there are some positive impact over the short term. Well, also the very might be interesting thing is the USA GDP will decline because of the rebalancing in Asia. Here, the capital movement plays an important role, because this increase in the output or consumption in Asia or China will attract more capital from the United States because there are free capital mobility, even though there are some restrictions, and will reduce investment in foreign countries. That's basically the capital movement. But of course, I mean, there are trade linkages, so each country will have a different impact. If trade, positive spillovers through trade in the short term may play the more positive impact on the economic growth in foreign countries. So this is basically net impact. You need to look at the positive trade impact as well as the negative impact through the investment decline. Well, trade balance, actually this consumption rebalancing is supporting the very popular argument of the rebalancing of the trade balances. Actually, the trade balances will decline in Asia because of the consumption increase, and then the United States trade balance will increase. So if you are interested in the global rebalancing in the current account imbalances, I think this is the right way to implement in Asia. Okay, this is the summarized the shocks, impact of the shocks to over the globally, not just the United States, but including other regions and other countries from the China's shock as well as the Asian shock. And as you can see, the spillovers over the long term almost zero, and both from the China and Asia. Okay, there are productivity shocks, and positive productivity shock will have a significant positive impact on GDP in Asia. So you can see this again. I mean, this red line is China, and the green line is Asia, and we can see especially this shock to all Asian countries will have a very significant positive impact. And then also United States GDP will have positive spillovers through the trade linkages. So actually productivity shock is better from the global perspectives. So I think it's the Asian countries' improvement in the productivity, especially in the China, will have a strong positive impact on the Asian countries. Here, actually, not just China or Japan also played a very important role, because we are assuming the overall productivity increase include productivity increase in the Japan's. So the gap, you can see that some gaps between the. Okay, so trade balance, we see some deterioration. The trade balances in Asian countries will help to reduce the surplus in Asian countries due to these productivity shocks. But at the short term, maybe it will deteriorate. This deterioration will eventually go back to the balance. Okay. So this is summarizing the snapshots of the global spillovers. So let me suggest some policies from these papers. Of course, I mean, this is not really based on only the empirical result we just produced here. Well, I think it's the Asia needs maybe two sources of the economic growth, but rebalancing the source of growth will require not just it will require a combination of the policy measures, including the demand rebalancing, but also the supply side productivity increase. That's the very important message here. For the domestic rebalancing, in the paper, we suggest some policies strengthen private consumption by transferring more corporate savings to household, and also the government can increase the social spending on health and education and housings. For the investment, we cannot really generalize, because some countries may have some overinvestment, but improving the investment climate would be really, really beneficial for the Asian countries. Especially promoting the service productivity would be important for Asian countries, because this rebalancing is not just between the external demand and domestic demand, but also this export industry and the domestic industries. And the service industries as domestic industries is quite lag behind export industry in terms of productivity in these countries, most of the Asian countries. So promoting service industry, especially modern service industries, would be the key for the next stage of the economic growth in Asian countries. We have a lot of the policy suggestions to improve the productivity is usual growth strategies. One is the financial development, because we need to allocate resources between the domestic industries and the export industries, or non-tradables and the tradables. So how to allocate the resources more effectively? Well, it cannot rely on the government hand. So improving the financial sector would be also helpful to improve resource allocations in Asia. So I don't want to summarize the result, so let me stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you for a very excellent presentation and good timekeeping. Next speaker is Dr. Lardy from the Peterson Institute.
Well, thank you very much. I also would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to participate in this conference. I think China is obviously very important in the story about global growth potential. It's the second largest economy, the biggest trading economy. And a lot of people, of course, are forecasting that China is likely to have a financial crisis very soon and that its long-term growth is heading down perhaps quite sharply. I think the most widely quoted forecast by Michael Pettis in Beijing is that China's growth 2013 through 10 years will average something between 3% and 4%. And I have a somewhat more optimistic view based on what the Chinese announced at their big party meeting last fall, what they plan to do in terms of basic economic reforms. And obviously first on the list is the very important statement that they made for the first time ever, that markets will play a decisive role in the allocation of resources. Of course, the history here is 20 years ago, they talked about markets playing a supplementary role. Then 10 years ago, they talked about markets and the state playing a somewhat equal role. But now they have moved to say that markets will play a decisive role in the allocation of resources. There are two other elements. There are many, many elements in the reform program that were outlined last November. I'm only going to talk about two of them. Market-oriented interest rate liberalization, particularly on the deposit side. The lending side has already been completely liberalized. And the second element I'm going to talk about is the demonopolization or the liberalization or opening up to large parts of the economy to more competition. And that's particularly important in the services sector, where the state firms still have a very dominant role compared to what's happened in the industrial sector. I'll begin by just stating my view, and that is that I think we've underappreciated the extent to which growth over the last 35 years has been driven by the rise of the private sector. This is just showing you what's happened over time to the share of industrial output being produced by state-owned companies, starting out at about 75%, going down to 25%. If we include collective industries, which are sometimes heavily influenced by local governments, we were at 100% back in 1978, and we're way under 30% today if you add in collective industries. If you just look at manufacturing, which is the black short line, the share of state-owned companies is now down to 20%. Obviously, in utilities, state has a lot of monopolies, and that pulls up the industry average. But in the manufacturing sector, which has been critically important in China, private firms have almost entirely displaced state-owned companies. Now, the reason that this has been very important to growth is that productivity, as measured by return on assets, is substantially higher in the private sector than it is in state-owned firms. As you can see, for the last 15 years or so, there's always been a positive differential. It has actually widened quite significantly since 2006, and we're now looking at a return on assets differential between state and private firms of almost 3 to 1. That is, private firms are making much, much more effective use of capital. So it's the shift in output, the shift in investment to higher productivity, higher return on asset private firms that has been a major driver of economic growth. And just to focus briefly, that's how the private sector has grown so rapidly, in part because most investment is in China in the entire reform period has been financed from retained earnings. If you have a return on assets almost 3 times state companies, obviously private companies can grow much more rapidly. The last 10 years, 2/3 of all investment in the non-financial corporate sector has been financed from retained earnings. You can see what that has meant in terms of who's investing in the industrial sector. We're now up to almost 3/4 of all investment is being undertaken by private firms. The state share is down to barely 10%. So it's been a very, very dramatic transformation. Again, if you go back to the late 70s, early 80s, the state and collective share combined was basically 100%. So 3/4 of all investment is undertaken by private firms. And I should say I'm always talking about private firms, and I'm only putting in indigenous private firms. There's a substantial amount of additional investment undertaken by wholly foreign-owned companies, which also should be considered private, and that would boost this up probably another roughly 10 percentage points of fixed investment. Now, what's the rebalancing solution, and how does this fit in? Basically, my argument is that liberalization of deposit rates is going to raise lending rates. It's going to raise deposit rates that the banks have to pay. If banks pay more on their liabilities, they'll seek to earn more on their assets. I think that will help to reduce investment as a share of GDP, which is, I would call, super elevated today. It will also take away the advantage that the industrial sector has had from underpriced capital and will lead to a more rapid growth of the services sector, and that will contribute to wage growth, the growth of wage share of GDP and so forth, and will help to increase household consumption as a share of GDP. Now, the evidence on the deposit rate side is fairly straightforward. The black line here is the fixed ceiling on a one-year deposit in nominal terms that has been set by the central bank. These rates have been set all the way back for decades, but we're beginning to see de facto liberalization of deposit rates through money market funds, wealth management products, and other under-regulated or unregulated parts of the financial system. And you can see the deposit rates in this unregulated sector are substantially higher than they are in the regulated sector. Wealth management products now have an amount equal to about 15% of bank deposits, so it's beginning already to have a significant effect on the cost of funds for banks. If all the deposit rates were liberalized over time, I think the deposit rate would go up. And if banks, as I said, have to pay more on their liabilities, they'll try to earn more on their assets. So it's a very competitive banking sector in some ways. So I think lending rates would go up. So the sequence here, the channels are, if you raise deposit rates, you're going to have higher income from bank savings. Households have deposits in the banking system still that are equal to almost 100% of GDP. In real terms, they've been earning nothing for the last 10 years on average. So that would raise disposable income. The second channel is as bank funding costs go up, they're going to increase the lending rate. I think that will drive more lending to private firms. Private firms are still relatively underserved. And it's also going to lower the rate of investment as a share of GDP. I think it will reduce the profit share of GDP and contribute to an increase in the wage share of GDP. And similarly, on the bottom line, I think we'll see the subsidy to industry being reduced. We'll see more investment in services. That'll lead to more growth of employment, since services are much more labor intensive, and that should increase the wage share of GDP. Now, already banks are beginning to lend a significant amount of funds to the private sector. You can see here lending to the private sector in the last 3 years for which we have the data is substantially ahead of lending to state firms. This is contrary to what most people assert and what you will read many times per year in The Economist and the Financial Times and many other sources. But the key point here is the best estimate is that the private sector is producing a little over 2/3, maybe as much as 3/4 of GDP. So the private sector is still relatively underserved by the financial system. And so if you have higher lending rates, state firms are already earning, if you go back to this diagram, the return on assets for state firms in the industrial sector is substantially below the cost of capital. So I think when rates go up, state firms are going to have less access to capital from the banking system. Their return on assets is very low, so they will continue, they will fade away at an accelerated pace. Now, the other component of the reform that I think is very important is to liberalize the services sector. Many portions of the service sector are still highly monopolized by state companies, and you can see the contrast in this diagram, which shows investment by state and private companies in the services sector, and contrast it with what I showed you earlier on what's happening in the industrial sector. And I mean, basically the takeaway is that state companies are in share of investment in services is about 4 times higher than their share of investment in manufacturing. And since investment in services now account for more than around 55% of total capital formation, this is a very substantial amount of investment. I don't have a good time series like I had for the industrial sector on return on assets, but for the years where we have good data, the state company return on assets in the services sector is about 3.3%, and private companies is over 6%. So there's a 2-to-1 differential in terms of return on assets for private companies on the one hand and state companies on the other. State companies are investing a share in the services sector that is 4 times what it is in the manufacturing sector, and it's 55% of all investment. So I think this is a tremendous opportunity for improving the allocation of capital and contributing to economic growth going forward as the private sector moves ahead in services, if indeed they are demonopolized, as has been promised. Just to show you more specifically modern services, which somebody just mentioned, you can see the state really dominates information transmission, software, IT, financial intermediation is very, very heavily state-dominated, as is leasing and leasing and business services is one exception where the private sector is a little bit further ahead. So these are the sectors that contribute so much to economic growth. This is where the returns of state companies are extremely low. So my view is that if these reforms are implemented over a period of time, we will see substantial rebalancing. I think we'll see more employment growth because the service sector will grow more rapidly. We will see a rising wage share of GDP. We'll see an increase in household income. We will see an increase in private consumption, and we will see a reduction in the rate of investment as a share of GDP, which is currently in the high 40s. It is worth noting that the private share of consumption bottomed out in 2010 and has been slowly rising since then. So this is a turn that is already underway on a relatively, actually very slow pace. But I think if the Chinese government follows through on these commitments to liberalize on the deposit side and opens up the services sector to private investment, as they have done in the manufacturing sector, that this can be a very positive development for sustaining China's economic growth going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lardy. Now we are going to have 2 discussants, and the first one is Professor Takeo Hoshi from Stanford.
Thank you. I want to start by thanking the organizer, the Bank of Korea, for inviting me to this excellent conference. The focus of my research has been on neighboring country of Korea to the east. But all the issues, all the topics discussed here, how the potential growth is impacted by the demographic change, financial crisis, innovation, and rebalancing, all of those has been an important issue for Japan as well. And it is great for me to learn from renowned experts in each area. So in preparing this comment in this session, I didn't understand or ignored the instruction from the organizer that first discussant is supposed to focus on the first paper or discuss the first paper, and the second discussant is supposed to discuss the second paper. So I prepared a comment for commenting on both papers. And actually what I prepared doesn't quite comment on either papers, because what I will do is to talk about what I have been looking at, the Japanese experience, and how these two papers relate to the Japanese experience, and how these papers can help me understand better the Japanese experience, and how the Japanese experience can inform the issue we are discussing here. So I have my slides for summarizing each paper, but both John Hua and Nick did a great job going through their papers, so I skipped these and get right into my discussion. So this shows Japan's experience of, in a sense, rebalancing in the past 50 years or so. And Japan's experience during this period, in the last 40 years or so, can be understood as a story of an economy that tries to find a way to park massive saving. And I think Hugh Patrick at Columbia was the first one to point this out 15 years ago or so. But I think this is the right way to understand Japan's experience. And what I show here is from a flow of funds account, and this to me, seems to be the best way to understand how the imbalance, both externally and internally, for Japan changed over time. And the green line shows the personal, the financial surplus for the personal sector, including household and the nonprofit. There is a discontinuity in the series in 1998, so we can't really compare the series before 1998 and after 1998. But all the series, financial surplus or deficit, divided by GDP. The second, the blue series, is for corporate sector, excluding financial intermediaries. Red line is for the government sector, including not only the general government, but local government and the social security funds and so on. And finally, the purple line in the middle is the foreign sector. So what happened in the last 40 years or so? Before 1975, we can say Japan's situation was, in a sense, balanced, because financial surplus of household sector was offset by the financial deficit of corporate sector. So there was a high active investment sector, which was able to absorb the massive saving of the Japanese economy. But after 1975, things started to change. In the late 1970s, the investment dropped and imbalance emerged. The saving didn't drop. And initially, it was balanced by a large budget deficit. Japanese government ended up running a huge budget deficit to absorb the savings of the household. And also in the early 1980s, as the budget deficit slightly started to shrink, trade imbalance emerged. And this was a period when we saw trade conflict, often occasional trade conflicts with U.S., Japan and the U.S. And towards the end of 1980s, there was, in a sense, rebalancing as the trade surplus shrunk a little bit, and investment started to surge. So the corporate sector restarted to run a financial deficit. And this was supported by the speculative bubbles, at least we found out ex post. So in 1990s to 2000 was after the collapse of the bubbles, and budget deficit again replaced the investment. But at the same time, the savings started to shrink, so which helped to balance the Japanese economy. But at the same time, investment dropped as well. So the financial deficit in the corporate sector turned financial surplus in late 1990s and 2000. So the saving investment gap as a private sector as a whole remained. And there's an interesting episode in mid-2000. There was a kind of rebalancing, the imbalancing, the reemergence of the trade imbalance as a budget deficit shrinks. But after the global financial crisis, the budget deficit started to increase again. So now what's happening is household saving declined for Japan. So the household saving, the massive household saving, which created a kind of problem for the Japanese economy because they didn't find an effective way to park those savings, is gone. But corporate saving is still there, and external balance is more or less restored, but the budget deficit is financed by the corporate savings. So this is another way to see the rebalancing of the Japan's experience, and which is more in line with John Watt's paper. I plot 1 minus exports divided by GDP. So this is a dependence on domestic demand. And we can see some rebalancing in the Japanese episode. During the bubble period, the domestic investment or domestic demand increased a lot. So this is late 1980s. And also, there was an export-led growth in the mid-2000s. This was a reemergence of a trade imbalance for Japan, looking from the financial flows. And that was ended in the global recession, and there seems to be some rebalancing after the global financial crisis. And another thing I wanted to look at for Japan, because the first paper, John Watt's paper, looks at the export, the dependence on export by the economy. And as we saw in John Watt's table, Japan's dependence on export is rather low compared to the U.S. So in terms of the level, Japan doesn't depend so much on export. Japan's domestic sector is big. But in terms of growth, almost all come from the growth in exports. So if we compare the economy to, say, a plane, Japan has a very big engine, the domestic demand engine, but it's not working. And it's only flying with an external demand engine. And when the external demand engine stops, it crashes. So that's been a problem for Japan. So it's one thing which I think we need to think about is how we measure the dependence on export. And if we look at the export to GDP in level, as John Watt's paper do, Japan doesn't look so much depend on exports. But in terms of growth, if we look at the change, Japan is quite vulnerable to external shocks. So the growth dependence of export, or the export dependence on growth, may be something we may want to look at, in addition to the dependence in level. So I have 4 brief comments relating to the Japanese experience and to the papers in this session. And the first one is the relation between rebalancing and financial crisis. And Japan experienced a rebalancing in the late 1980s. And this was happened through a credit boom with asset price bubbles. So this may be similar to what China is going through, at least according to some observers of China. And the Nick's paper talks about, or gives a little bit optimistic view about the possibility of the collapse of the Chinese credit boom, and point out the 4 reasons why we shouldn't expect China to collapse anytime soon or drastically. But all of these conditions apply to Japan's bubble economy, maybe with an exception of the third one, high national saving rate. China has an even higher saving rate than Japan, but still the Japanese saving rate back then was considered to be very high. For Japan, the correction of the credit boom wasn't smooth. And so I think that we can't be really complacent about the Chinese experience. The second one, the one thing we learned by looking at the history of a Japanese rebalancing, the rebalancing took many forms. And in the 1970s, the budget deficit absorbed the saving investment gap. The 1980s, the trade surplus played a role. And there was a balancing through bubbles in the 1980s. So one thing I think we need to think about is the impact of rebalancing on the economic growth or the demand, the type of question John Watt's paper is asking, may depend on what kind of channel the rebalancing happens. If it happens through a high investment supported by the credit boom, or if it happens through a budget deficit or something. So that may be one channel or the distinction that we may want to think about. And the third one, I already commented on the looking at the level. Japan doesn't seem to depend on the export very much, but looking at the growth, Japan has depended almost entirely on exports, even today. So so this is one thing we need to think about when we consider the impact of the rebalance, what we mean by rebalancing of the external balance. And finally, both papers argue that the structural reforms that lead to a productivity growth is an important, is a crucial thing which should accompany the rebalancing. And I think we can see the same thing by looking at Japan's experience. So very briefly, we can consider Japan's experience overall is experience of rebalancing attempts without structural reforms. Of course, I'm simplifying here, exaggerating. Japan did some structural reforms, but many people argue it was lacking. So, important thing to note here is Japan tried, or Japanese government at least claimed they tried structural reforms several times, including the current attempt under Abe administration, comprehensively called Abenomics. So the big question is, especially for China, can and will China really implement an ambitious reforms that Nick talked about of the third, expressed in the third plenum? They say the markets will play a decisive role in the allocation of resources, and that's a very ambitious goal, and I wish the Japanese government declares that, which they never have done. But for similar to Japan, this is not the first time that China declares the need for reforms either. The Hu Jintao also emphasized the need for reforms. So the big question is if this time is different. And talking with the China experts like Nick and also my former colleague at UC San Diego, Barry Norton, they seem to be more optimistic about China's reform this time. So it's comforting to note that China experts think this time is different. And the same question applies to Japan, and I don't have time to comment on Japan, but I look forward to the remark by Professor Iwata in the next session.
Thank you, Takeo. The next discussion is Professor Kwon Shin of Korean University.
Okay. I also would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to this nice conference. And I am supposed to comment on Nick Loddy's paper, so I'll stick to this paper. And I really like the paper, not just because the paper is very short, but because it has many insightful arguments, so I really enjoyed it. So let me start with the summary of the paper. And he thinks that even though many people point out the possibility of the credit crisis in China, he thinks that the likelihood is low. And the reason is the following. All of the credit is domestic origin, and China's bank credit boom is largely financed by deposits rather than through the wholesale market, which is more dangerous in terms of the possibility of bank runs. And China's national saving rate is very high, around 50%, and it has very strong external position. Even though the current account surplus now is lowered, but still is positive 2%. And he's even more optimistic about the policies China is implementing. And two key policies China is implementing is the liberalization of deposit rates and elimination of state monopolies. And I'm not sure whether he really distinguishes between short run and long run. But in many cases, if the country experiences this kind of structural changes, then in the short run at least, they suffer from some growth slowdown. But he thinks that maybe even in the short run, this kind of policies are growth enhancing. And the reason is that he showed the differences between the returns differences between the private sector and the state sector, so that the transfer of funds from state to the private sector will increase the output. And the high income coming from liberalized interest rates, which is higher, that will increase the consumption relative to the GDP, and that's another reason why he thinks this policy is very effective. So I have 4 comments. I'll talk about the possibility of growth slowdown, and then I'll argue that maybe a risk of more abrupt adjustment is not low. And third, I'll talk about some problems with the deposit rate liberalization. And finally, I'll talk about some other imbalances China faces. So the possibility of growth slowdown. Historical evidence strongly suggests that all fast-growing economies have slowed down at some point. So there are some empirical findings there. And we also know that theory suggests that a catch-up economy, when they approach the technological frontier, they will start to slow down. The reason is that there are not many workers now to transfer from the agricultural sector to faster-growing manufacturing sector, and the second reason is that capital accumulates. Marginal productivity of capital also decreases. And finally, at the beginning you can learn easily from foreign countries, but at some stage you have to develop your own technology, which is much tougher. So all this suggests that at some stage the growth slowdowns. And this is the empirical distribution of growth slowdowns. And this is the per capita GDP. And empirically, if there are many cases of growth slowdown around 11 when the per capita GDP is around 11,000. So that's their mode. And the second mode is around $15,000 per capita GDP. And this is the graph I got from the study I did with Barry and Park. And in that paper, we tried to find some factors which are associated with growth slowdowns. And there are many factors, actually. The first factor is per capita GDP. I just showed you that growth tends to slow down in the range of $11,000 and $15,000. And there are many other factors like the higher pre-slowdown growth. So your growth rate is higher before slowdown, then your likelihood is getting higher. High investment rate, undervalued exchange rates, and we talked about demographic changes yesterday, but this high aging is also related to growth slowdown, and less open economies, less human capital, and interestingly, positive political regime change is also related to growth slowdown, and less high-tech contents of exports, and financial instability. And this is a little bit tricky because the main reason why this kind of crisis leads to growth slowdown is not by itself, but because the investment rate decreases after the crisis. So what is the chance for China's slowdown then? China's growth rate is already decelerating from 10% in 2010 to less than 8% expected in 2014. So this 2% decrease, that is the, that belongs to our definition of growth slowdowns I did with Barry. But the question is whether it's persistent slowdown or temporary slowdown. In our case, we defined growth slowdown when the persistency stays longer than 7 years. So we have to see whether this is permanent. And China's current per capita GDP at 2005 purchasing power parity prices now estimated to over 7,000. So 10% growth rate may be China's current GDP, per capita GDP is about $10,000, which is close to our mode of the growth slowdown. So I think that the chance is pretty good, but China appears to be doing better in terms of the technology. So their technology content in exports is better than average countries that experience growth slowdown. But other factors such as aging, population aging, high investment ratio, undervalued exchange rates, indicate that they are more likely to experience growth slowdown. So their chance of growth slowdown is pretty high. And next comment is about a possibility of more abrupt adjustment. Many people point out that NPLs in the banking sector in China are pretty high. They are increasing continuously. And some people say that a burst of housing bubble has already begun. And some people also point out the danger of shadow banking in China. And there is some sign that their investment is getting more and more inefficient, and there is some sign of overcapacity. I don't have time to go over one by one here, but I'll focus on the first element here. So this is the 20-year average investment rate here, and 20-year average growth rate over here. And there is a positive relationship between investment rate and growth rate. And China is here. It has the extremely high investment rate and extremely high growth rate, but more or less on this line. So this is long-term relationship. But if you look at the short-term relationship, this is the 7-year performance of the investment rate and growth for China. This red line is China, but you can see that more recently, even though our investment rate is increasing, it's over 50 and close to 55, but the growth rate is actually decreasing. And there are many other countries like here which experience the same kind of pattern in the short run, but in the end, like the Korea here, it has experienced the same kind of pattern, but eventually it experienced kind of crisis. Let me show you this graph here. So Korea growth rate is pretty high at the beginning, but in this range, actually growth rate decreased, but investment rate actually increased. That's that range. Then eventually it experienced kind of crisis. So this kind of pattern shows that maybe there is some sign that China can experience more drastic growth slowdown. And third comment is about deposit rate liberalization. And he thinks that this is very effective policy. And what is the reason? The reason is that it will increase household income because basically now the deposit rate will increase. And this increasing lending rate will eventually make the banks make the less lending to the private sector, so the investment rate will decrease, and this will reduce profit share of GDP and the increased wage share. And he also thinks that this kind of the eliminating monopolies and this kind of deposit rate liberalization will eventually reduce implicit subsidy to industry and increase investment in services and increase employment and growth. But I think that, as Takio also pointed out, this kind of financial liberalization is sometimes very dangerous and likely to lead to financial fragility, especially when, the banking sector in China has huge amounts of NPLs. And if they have higher deposit rate, their profit will shrink and maybe they will be in trouble. And he thinks that investment rate will decrease, but because of efficient allocation, eventually output will increase. But so this kind of efficient allocation, it's not so easy. I mean, in Korea, we also attempted many things to make the financial sector efficient, but there's no sign of efficiency even these days. So I don't think that this kind of policy can make instantaneously the China's financial system much more efficient, so that this kind of investment can take place. And finally, given other distortions like the households in China faces, there is no guarantee that this consumption will increase as much he likes to have. And my final comments is about other imbalances. And China actually faces many other imbalances: investment, consumption imbalance, public-private sectors imbalance, manufacturing versus service sector imbalances, financial repression, housing bubble, rise in income inequality, and disparity across regions, and so on. And I think that maybe they need some other policies to deal with these kind of imbalances as well. And these two key policies probably are not enough to deal with all these imbalances. So let me conclude. Rebalancing China is a great challenge not only for China, but also for the world economy, as the Zhonghua pointed out. I think that the two policies China is implementing can be good policies, but are not enough for rebalancing. And even if China is successful in avoiding a crisis, I think that there are, forces, fundamental forces that lead to inevitable growth slowdown. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chen. Now we have two presentations and two discussions, and then before we ask the two speakers to respond to this discussion, I'd like to collect questions from the floor so the speakers can respond to that questions too. So if you have any questions, Professor Barra.
Well, I just had a question for each of the authors. So in Zhonghua's research, I had a tough time distinguishing consequences from changes in the volume of international trade, which of course can have efficiency effects that are kind of classical in origin, versus changes in exports kind of for given imports, where you would think about that as perhaps some part of demand and part of aggregate demand. And I didn't see from the results that I was able to look at right now how to distinguish those two kinds of impacts, particularly on growth. Then I just had one question for Nick. I probably just missed this, but I didn't understand how the regional local governments were treated in the analysis where you had a state sector and a private sector. I didn't understand how the regional local governments were treated and kind of what is the appropriate way to think about them, since I've seen arguments that there was effectively a lot of competition among those governments, and in some sense they might be more like the private sector than the state sector, but I just didn't understand what you actually did in terms of that division.
Okay, thank you. Barry?
I guess this question is primarily for Nick, although Zhonghua, if you want. How much rebalancing and restructuring occurs in China will depend on how the authorities respond as growth slows down. And it's hard for us non-specialists to assess that. Late last week, they reduced reserve requirements for the banks, an interpretation of which could be that they're concerned about the weakening of the property market, and this is to encourage more lending to property developers and the like. Is that a plausible interpretation of what's going on, which would suggest that they remain committed to 7.5% growth, and that if they don't get it, restructuring will be the casualty?
Thank you. Dr. Choi?
I think this session's presentations are very useful, all are complementary, conducive to further discussions. I have one question about Professor Lee's model analysis. In analyzing model 2, he has different shocks, especially a rebalancing shock versus rebalancing neutral productivity shocks. I'm wondering whether rebalancing shocks is driven by policy or some market forces, or unsustainable forces which results in some abrupt changes in the structure.
Using the prerogative of the session chair, I'd like to ask a couple of questions to Zhonghua Lee. Yeah, I'm interested why, according to your result, the rebalance seems to work for China, but we don't see that kind of a benefit in the panel results. So I would appreciate if you could elaborate and on what is the story behind that. And then the other one is also when you talk about the global spillovers, you estimate from the large TSG model, Korea does not seem to benefit from the productivity shock in China. Your kind of impulse response shows that although Korea benefits a lot from the productivity shock in all Asian countries, but not from China. So maybe it's kind of an interesting point. So I'd like to hear some of your views. Okay, we have 15 minutes, so I'd like to return to two speakers to respond. So, Chong-hwa, go.
So first of all, thank you very much for a very useful comment. Let me respond to the Takeo's comment first. He gave a very useful comment. A couple of things. First of all, I think he's right. What would be the format of the rebalancing, or what would be the instrument of the rebalancing would matter a lot for, I think it's for economic growth. I mean, he distinguished several different types of the rebalancing that occurred in Japan. I think it's clearly, I mean, we are not supporting any rebalancing by creating the bubbles in the real estate or investment. I mean, so I think it's and also he supports this Japanese experience that rebalancing attempt should be combined together with structural reforms to become more effective. I mean, I think that's quite consistent with what we have found out from the data in other Asian countries. But also, he asked whether we could do more experiment by looking at the channels of the rebalancing through especially the government policies and, for example, government consumption versus private consumption or the government infrastructure investment. We started to do a lot of experiment, but we stopped because there were already too many tables and figures, and then maybe so. But I think it would be interesting. We did a little bit, and then we didn't report here. That's I think it's we also he raised the issue how to measure external dependence. I mean, not just the export share, but the contribution of export growth to GDP growth would be ideal measure. One note I would say is still, even for that measure, it's better to use the value-added term. Often it is used by using the contribution of the net export growth to the GDP growth, and sometimes it got very strange numbers, but I think it's better to use the value-added terms. But it's actually only recently we got this kind of data using the input-output structure. I mean, so, but I know that the IMF produced some data, so we can add some data into the paper. Whether China can implement the reforms, I mean, I asked Nick would answer that question. But some reforms, I mean, China is quite serious to do. So we'll see. I mean, even though it's difficult, but whether they will. One thing I should make a note is your comment is quite useful, because whenever I go to China and then have this kind of discussions, they always say we need to avoid the Japan's experience. They say so. It's actually Japan gives the right lesson to China, so they will try to avoid another crisis, but Japan or Korea suffered. Robert Barrow's comment, I think it's this is also related to the VAR. Of course, I mean, this export volume versus net export, I mean, these kind of things we can do experiment in the simulation model. But VAR, we did another one using only export increase given import. I mean, it's a similar result. But of course, but here we just increase the domestic demand. That means as a ratio decline in the net export. So that's basically in this experiment. But we can do in different way. But of course, I mean, this is basically to get the information from the existing data, assuming some kind of structural restrictions. So how we could justify theoretically for all kind of the findings. That's another one. I didn't get clearly what Barry gave comment. This I just passed to the Nick. And Ungye Cha's comment on that this is also related to the, I think this comment is basically, so what kind of the rebalancing would be important? I mean, I think that's your suggestion. I mean, we did some simulations too, and we didn't put all things here, but we can elaborate it more. And Junhee Kim's comment here is one important thing is the productivity increase in China will attract the capital from. We have a lot of discussion on this. This is really depending on how you assume the model structure. I mean, because this simulation model assumes anyway some kind of the parameters, and then if you really believe that the huge productivity increase in China will attract capital from Korea, that will be negative shock to Korea. If you really believe trade spillover will be much stronger than this relocation of the capital, that will be positive impact. I mean, currently we got quite insignificant impact. I mean, we cannot really say strong negative, but basically this trade effect is combined together with relocation would give the quite insignificant impact on Korea, but it's slightly negative. Yes.
Thank you. Dr. Lardy?
Let me take Professor Barrows' comment first. I'm sorry, my paper wasn't very clear on the definitions. My definition of state here in this paper is traditional state-owned companies, plus those that have gone through an ownership transformation, corporatization. They have, definition by shares. So a state company is any company in which the state is the majority or dominant owner. It includes both central and local. And I think the evidence we have shows that local state firms are even less efficient. They have lower return on assets than the average figure that I showed. There are tens of thousands of local state firms, even left in the manufacturing sector, that seem to have very low productivity. And if competition is increased, I think they'll probably have to continue to shrink. On Barry's question, it's a very interesting one. Will the urge to reform wane if growth slows down enough? I don't think it's a linear response. I think at the beginning, some further growth slowdown will put a greater priority on restructuring, but below some point, I don't know what that point is, it's 5% or 5.5%, then reform probably slows down quite a bit. But I think as we've seen in recent weeks, the authorities are resisting a big cut in the required reserve ratio, which for the big banks is up around 21%. They're doing very targeted cuts for specific financial institutions that lend more to micro and small-sized companies, which are overwhelmingly private. They're doing targeted central bank relending to support certain kinds of activities. So rather than a general loosening of credit, they're having a more fine-tuned response, and that's what I'm hoping to see going forward. Now, on the Japan case, the lessons of Japan. Certainly in China, there's a great deal of concern, a desire to understand the Japanese case better, to see what the lessons are for China. But I would make a couple of points. First of all, on the saving investment imbalance has already been taken care of in China. The current account surplus has gone from 10.1% of GDP in 2007 to 2.1% last year. So they're not trying to rebalance both domestically and internationally at the same time. The big challenge now is rebalancing domestically, and I think savings and investment can both fall and keep the external balance at a fairly modest level and get more domestic demand from consumption and less from investment. And I do think there's a very substantial potential for savings to fall. Households are now saving over 40% of disposable income. It's just extraordinary. I don't know any country that's ever had savings from disposable income in the household sector that high. The second thing I would say is that China's has been over-investing in property. Certainly, I've written about that for the last 5 years, but I don't think they have a bubble that's anywhere near the scale that Japan had in the 80s. The best research I've seen shows that, yes, property prices have gone up quite a bit, but remember, incomes are going up by 8%, 9% per year over this period, so the affordability ratio has not really gone up very much. And in Japan, at least the data I've seen, suggests there was a massive increase in house prices relative to income. So I think Japan had a much, much bigger property bubble, housing and land bubble than we've seen in China. So that doesn't mean China will necessarily succeed, but I don't want to overinterpret and project the Japanese experience on the Chinese case. I think China has a better shot at a smooth rebalancing. On the factors Professor Shin mentioned that are pointing to a China slowdown inevitably, well, some of them, yes, I agree with, but some I don't agree with. There's an enormous potential for additional transfer of labor. Even though the labor force is falling, there are 200 million people in the countryside engaged in non-agricultural activities. These are entrepreneurs. Their capital stock is extremely low. As wages continue to rise, some of them will transfer into urban activities where their capital stock will be much higher and their productivity will be much higher. So there's still plenty of room for labor transfer in China, even if you don't take more people out of the agricultural sector. I think capital stock per worker is still quite low. I think return on assets is very weak in the state sector. But if you looked at the data on what's in the private sector, even though their share of investment has gone up, there's no indication that productivity as measured by ROA is declining. So I'm not so sure about that. The high old age dependency ratio, we had an extensive discussion of this yesterday. China has enormous room to address this problem through policy changes of the type we discussed yesterday. Most women that are in the labor force are retiring in their early 50s. Males are retiring, in their late 50s. So there's plenty of room to make adjustments so that the high old age dependency ratio is not a bigger drag on economic growth. I don't think undervalued currency is a factor in China anymore. I think their exchange rate is, as their current account has fallen by 80%, that they're much closer to some kind of equilibrium value than they were a few years ago. I think the banks can adjust to higher deposit rates. I think the stress will be in the corporate sector. We've already seen that in the environment over the last year, as banks are having to pay more for some types of deposits, that net interest margins have not compressed, that profitability has held up fairly well. I think what's happening is that less money is flowing to state companies, and that's why some of the very positive signs we've seen in recent months are a company like PetroChina, which is a gigantic firm that has a terribly low rate of return on assets. They're trying to sell off a 30% interest in their distribution business. So I think we will see more state companies selling off assets in order to survive in the higher interest rate environment that we're moving into. So I'm not convinced that China is headed for I don't think they're going to grow at 10%. I will concede that. But I think with the right kind of policy mix, they can easily grow another over the medium term at 7.5%, 8%.
Thank you. I think we are just on time, and I appreciate both two speakers and discussions about the very excellent presentation and discussions. So let me conclude this session, and we are ready to go for a coffee break. Thank you.